We are on Module 7, and it is entitled Synthesizing the Results to Answer the Research Question. So you should have both of your tables, 6A and 6B. So we're going to start with this video just talking about 6A, which is going to be what you're going to use to do assignment 7A. So this is important here on your 6105 Canvas page where it says number 2. Each individual study is no longer important. You are interested in the preponderance of evidence in the table. So write your review by columns, not by individual rows. So in other words, we're not going to describe the study a study by study. So we're not going to say study 1 did this, study 2 did this, study 3 did this. That's really called an annotated bibliography, and that's not what we are doing here. We are synthesizing the evidence. So we are interested in the big picture, not each individual study. So let's see, I'm going to go down here. So it says here in assignment 7A, your headings should be for assignment 7A, results, characteristics of the studies, and findings. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples and some of my comments with that. So this is the asthma study that we've been looking at that was submitted by a student. And there, page 5, it says results, characteristics of the studies. So it's perfectly in alignment with your assignment. So it has results, characteristics of studies, and then findings. So you can see this student went right along with the columns on the 6A table. So she started talking about the purpose, and overall they had the one common purpose, which was A, B, or C. She talked about the types of studies. All but 3 took place in the last 5 years. So it was the last, it gives you an idea of when they were done. They talk about the ages and the target population size. It ranged from 18 to over 900 children. Some of them had just elementary students, some were high school. The studies took place in a variety of locations in the United States and internationally. Half of them used some variation of this one certain type of intervention. And then all of them delivered interventions in multiple sessions over short times, periods of a month to a month and a half. Talked about when the data was collected, similarities, and the shortest interval was 1 month. Most studies collected data at more than one time. So it really just does give you an idea, because she's talking about asthma, education, and school-age children. So you can just kind of sit back and say, okay, some of them, it was a good range. It wasn't that they were all in elementary school or that they were all in high school. From what she's saying, what she summarized, they're all over the place in age. It's interesting that half of them use the exact same intervention. So that's kind of good. That's a neat thing to know. The sample size is important. So she says that it ranged from 18 to 900. So that's a big difference there. It just gives the reader an idea of who the people were in the studies. And then she talked about the findings. So here is where you would talk about your very last column, the significant and non-significant relationships or the efficacy of the intervention. So each of the studies considered the effect of the intervention on multiple indicators. They all evaluated the number of days of school missed. They talked about the changes in number of asthma-related ED visits. 4 out of 9 described a change in the number of asthma-related hospitalizations. 6 out of 9 reported a statistically significant decrease in the number of days of school missed. 4 out of 8 showed a statistically significant decrease in the number of ED visits. All but 1 had a general decrease in asthma-related ED visits. So she's really just going through and saying these were the results. The only thing I would like to see in this and this is what I ask of my students, is that you say, for example, if it says 4 out of 9 studies describe a change in the number of asthma-related hospitalizations, then I think that you should have the 4 citations there in parentheses so that the reader, if I want to know, okay, which one were those 4, then I can just see them very easily and go pull those. So that goes in alignment with all of the statements that she's making. I'd also like to see some statistics in there. So if you're saying there was a statistically significant decrease in 4 out of 8 studies, I want to see the citations and the p-values. And sometimes it might just be all p-values were less than 0.05 if that's what it is, or you can do the individual ones. But overall, I think this is a good example. It's one example of a way that you can summarize the characteristics of these studies. So let's look at another one. This one is the article we were talking about earlier, Policy Interventions for School Bullying. So let's go down to their findings. So their results are going to be, their subheadings are a little different than ours, but that's not a big deal. So basically, this little summary paragraph says that they had 21 studies, talks a little bit about them. So the methodological characteristics of the study. So this is one of your columns. So of the 21 studies, 12 used mixed methods, 8 were quantitative, 1 was qualitative. They were all cross-sectional. Most of them used convenience sampling. Some of them were probability. More than half used national samples, whereas 24% used samples from a single location or region. Again, it's just the same type of summary that gives you an idea of who are we talking about here? What do these participants look like? 80% were in the United States, and some had from other countries, so I think that's good. Then they go on, so these are different subheadings than we're using. So that was just the designs. This is a sample. So across the studies, sample size varied from 6 to 8,000. So again, I want to see, me personally, would like to see sample size varied from 6, put the citation, to 8,000 and put the citation, just so that the reader knows what you're talking about. Only the qualitative study had fewer than 50, and 2 studies had between 50 and 100. So it seems like you could say, oh, okay, they have a good combination of small and some really large ones too. Most commonly used participants were students, followed by school counselors, professionals, parents. Okay. Most were from K through 12 settings, whereas others were from a single school level, elementary or high school. Okay, it goes on to talk about some of them were diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, with most consisting about 2/3 white as well as black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern, and multiracial. It was good. They have here student samples were close to having equal proportion of males and females, so that's always good. And then they just go to talk about other little qualities about the students. Evaluation methods. All studies relied on self-report data to evaluate school bullying policy effectiveness. Okay, so that's referring to their methods, their measurements. They also talked in here about the statistical analysis, which, that's good to know also. This paragraph here, the measures used to assess bullying among students varied. So some used scales, whereas some used items developed by the researchers. So that is good to know. Okay, then they go to summarize the findings. So that was just the characteristics of the study. This is the findings. So here, results on policy effectiveness. So given that 21 studies differed on outcomes using their evaluations, results are presented by each outcome category. So that's how they divided it up. So this first one, perceptions of policy effectiveness. So here, 8 studies reported results on their perceptions of policy effectiveness. Results showed that 5 to 88% of educators perceive school bullying policies to be effective. And then it goes on to say other findings that are overall. Only one study measured the students' perception of policy effectiveness, and results showed that they perceived policies to be moderately effective. Okay. So student bullying, perpetration, and victimization. So here, 5 studies reported findings on this topic. 2 of them talked about policy in relation to effectiveness. Then it goes to talk about those individual findings. Let's see. So that's really all they're talking about, the rest of that part right there. This other subheading, anti-LGBTQ bullying. So 6 studies actually addressed this issue, which is really nice. And so they gave findings on what they found. You know, the 6 looked at them. This is what they found. What do they say? Let's see. Students in schools without anti-bullying policy or with an anti-bullying policy did not explicitly prohibit bullying based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Students in schools with comprehensive that included protections based on sexual identity and gender identity reported lower rates of anti-LGBTQ bullying. Okay. Educator intervention on bullying. So then there were some studies, and this one they only have 1, but for some reason they thought it was important enough to talk about where they find that result. So basically what you're doing when you have to summarize the findings is that you're going to have to figure out a way to group them, because you're not going to talk about them individually. So you need to figure out, how am I going to group these together in a way that makes sense to so that the reader really understands what I'm trying to convey, the message. So this is a third example, and I can talk to you about this one a little bit more. So this is the loneliness paper, and we're on page 543. And so here we have description of studies. So you know, all of these are going to be similar to what you have to do. And so I think you can look at the different examples to really see a template of how you want to do it. But so on mine, I just pulled out design. So there were 10 studies, 5 were cross-sectional, and you can see, so then I go ahead and list them. 5 were longitudinal, so then I list them. The follow-up period on the longitudinal ranged from 1 year to 68 years. So I thought that was kind of interesting to throw in there, that we had one study that was actually 68 years long. Most of them were from large population-based studies, and 2 studies were from the same cohort of participants, but they were 2 separate stories. Research studies, there were no qualitative. So then the sample, 8 out of 10 were conducted in Europe. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they weren't all in America. The number of students ranged from, the number of participants per study ranged from 466 to 13,000 for a total of 26,000 across all studies. All authors provided a description of the sampling. They included both genders. Most were community dwelling, independently living. The overall health status varied among participants, but most were described as healthy with a few chronic diseases. So that just gives you a vision that these are normal, healthy, elderly people living in the community. I do go here and say that none of the studies talked about their theoretical basis, but it really was implied, and that it was the same thought process as I was thinking about the HPA axis and inflammation and how that directly impacts inflammation. I talk about covariates because I thought with cognitive function, that was relevant to say that they did control for age and gender and education and some social network factors when they were talking about, when they were doing the statistics for this. So this is similar to yours, where you start with the measure. So this summarized the measure of loneliness. So measures of loneliness varied among most studies, but most utilized one or two Likert style format questions. So it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 of these articles just ask simple yes/no questions. And so then I have here the common questions were, do you feel lonely at the present time? How often do you feel loneliness? So you aren't going to go there and listen. These are all the exact 10 questions, but overall, this is what they asked pretty much. They were very similar. Then I say in another study, they used the revised UCLA scale for loneliness, so I talk about that. In another 2 studies, they use the De Jong-Gierfeld scale for loneliness, so I talk about that. Measurement of cognitive function, same thing. There were lots of different domains that were measured across all the different studies. So global cognitive, executive, verbal reasoning, processing. So I did list all the different groups of types of cognitive function. And then I talked about some of the most common measures that were used across studies. So again, I'm not going to sit here and talk about 50 different measurements that were used, but these are the most common that were used to measure global cognitive function. So in 6 of the 10 studies, they use the Mini-Mental. So then I talk about that. And that's what I do in those next 2 paragraphs. So then all of that is just the characteristics of the study. And again, it's just to give people an idea of what happened, what did they do, what do the people look like. And so then I went on to group my findings in terms of loneliness and then this different global cognitive function or the different part of cognitive ability. So this whole paragraph talks about loneliness and global cognitive function. The next one talks about loneliness and dementia. The next one, loneliness and memory. So there were 6 studies that looked at loneliness and memory specifically in all the different types of domains underneath memory, but you can see where I didn't talk about all 6 of them one by one. So I say here, 6 studies reported significant and non-significant findings between loneliness and various domains of memory, and I list them out. And in paragraph 2, in 3 of them, they looked at immediate and delayed recall, and they they found significant correlations. One found significant, one was not significant. So you group them together based on some common factor that you see. So I chose to group them again by loneliness and domain of cognitive function. And then, when I had the 6 studies in front of me, okay, now I still don't want to just go one by one. So I have these 6 studies that have something in common. How am I going to group them down even further to summarize what they found? So then I go on. There were lots of domains that were used. Loneliness and executive function, loneliness and intellect, loneliness and verbal fluency, loneliness and processing speed. So let's look at this. So in 3 cross-sectional studies, similar significant correlations were reported between loneliness and processing speed. And so I have the 3 authors listed. Although they used similar research designs, the sample varied widely from 466 to 13,000. Although, despite a large difference in sample size, all 3 groups found significant and negative associations. So that's kind of important to note because, you say, we always kind of tend to say that if they have a little sample size, then maybe we don't really believe their findings that much. But my message right here is, it didn't matter how small or how big the sample size was. They still all had the exact same finding. So again, this has gone longer than I wanted it to go, but I really just wanted to be able to give you some examples and talk you through some things. But for your paper, the way you write it, I would just get your 6A table and do your best to summarize, and do not talk about each individual study one by one. Talk about the overview, and that's really what we're looking for. So let us know if you need any help, and we'll get you taken care of.